video, we're going to discuss the concept of co-ownership in real property, and specifically tenancy in common. So let's get started. When two or more individuals own the rights to one parcel of real property, this is essentially the concept of co-ownership. So if we use this house as our example here, what you want to understand is whether it's 2 people or 100, multiple parties having rights to this house is the definition of co-ownership. And in different states, there are different ways and different methods in which co-ownership can take place. And typically we divide it into 2 separate categories. One is when you're not married, and the other categories are for married persons. So in this example, tenancy in common is generally reserved for those who are not married. Let's look at an example here. There's many different ways that tenancy in common can take place, but a common one is when heirs take possession and ownership of property. So let's say this house here is owned by a collection of children's mother, and she passes away and leaves it to her 3 children. So I'm going to go ahead and draw the 3 children here. There's child number 1, there's child number 2, and there's child number 3. And let's just assume that the mother has left them all an equal share, which is 1/3. We'll just divide it up equally. Now what you have here is what's known as an undivided fractional interest. Undivided means you've got one house, and all 3 are sharing this one house. So we're not dividing up the property, it's one property shared amongst the 3. And the fractional interest is obvious. Each of the heirs has a 1/3 interest. What makes tenancy in common important, and what makes it the concept that it is the control or the rights that each of the heirs here will have with their 1/3 interest. So to use an example of what ideas or what rights they may have, let's talk in the future and in the unfortunate event that child number 3 here passes away. What we want to understand is that child number 3 in tenancy in common has the right to do whatever they want with their 1/3 interest. So they could leave their 1/3 interest to their 2 children. And child number 1 here and child number 2 here cannot prevent this from happening. So now child number 3's 2 heirs are going to share in that 1/3 interest as a tenant in common along with the original 2. So in other words, you're dividing up a property and the percentage of ownership, and whatever your percentage of ownership is, you can do with it what you'd like. So another example here, rather than death, let's say that child number 2 has entered an agreement whereby they are going to buy the interest of child number 1. They can certainly do that, and therefore they'll have a 2/3 interest, while this one will go ahead and exit the tenancy. You see, these owners over here as tenants in common cannot say that child number 2 cannot buy or sell their interest. So in other words, whatever your interest is, you're allowed to do with it what you want. The final important term here is that of partition. Partition is the idea of splitting up a property. So what we've seen here is some partition, where different heirs are selling different interests to others, and they're splitting up and so forth. But really what partition is for is oftentimes, especially the more co-owners that you have, the right of partition means if they cannot decide what to do with the house. For instance, what if all 3 want to live here and they can't come to an amicable agreement? Well, then partition is to split it up. Since there's one house here, you can't split up the house. So that's where the other right of partition would be to sell the asset and to partition the money that it brings in, usually relative to the ownership interest that each has. So understand, in tenancy in common, it's typically the default system, and more often than not, if multiple owners have title to a piece of property, it's likely tenancy in common. And the deal is, whatever your fractional interest is, you essentially have the right to exercise any of the rights with your interest that you normally would. Hopefully this helps you understand the concept and pass your exam the first time. This was preparing for your test in 5 minutes or less.